Magandang hapon po sa ating lahat at palugod na pagbati mula sa Future Earth Philippines. Welcome po sa ika-105th episode ng the Filipino SDG Action Hour. At ngayon muli nyo kaming samahan sa isa't kalahating oras ng exciting at makabuluhang talakayan tungkol sa mga paksa na napapanahon at tiyak na kapupulutan ng aral at karunungan. At sa hapon na ito, hasamahan tayo ng ating panauhin na pag-usapan ang topic na pinamagatang environmental psychology and the rapidly emerging nexus of climate change and mental health. So alamin natin kung ano nga ba ang koneksyon ng climate change at mental health sa tulong po ng ating panauhin. So our speaker for today is an associate professor at the De La Salle University in Manila. And prior to his return to DLSU, he was a senior lecturer in the Department of Psychology and Sunway University in Kuala Lumpur. So his research program includes number one, the application of psychology principle in promoting environmental sustainability. Number two, the interface between climate change and mental health in the global south context. Number three, planetary health. And lastly, the mental health of neglected and marginalized population. He is an associate editor of the journal Global Environmental Psychology and is a member of the editorial board of BMC Psychology and Nature Communication Psychology. He is also a member of the advisory board and steering committee of the Global Forum on Humanitarian Health Research by the Fogarty International Center, National Institute of Health of the United States. He was awarded lang naman ng Outstanding Young Scientist of 2023 by the National Academy of Science and Technology, which is the highest award-giving body in the country. And he was also awarded the prestigious Alfredo Lagmay Award for Psychological Research by the Psychological Association of the Philippines. And ito po ha, based on the ranking made by John Leonidas of Stanford University, he was listed in the top 2%, 2% po ha, around the world of the scientists in all discipline. He also worked on the ground as an active clinical practitioner in the Philippines, providing mental health assessment, counseling, and psychotherapy for families, children, adolescent, and early adulthood. So sa hapon na ito, let's all welcome Dr. Jan Jamir Benson Aruta.
Salamat po, Sir Mark. Ninenervyos ako kanina, pero narinig ko yung music doon sa video. Medyo nabawasan yung nervyos ko.
Pa-
Kung mapapansin nyo po, we have a lot of attendees in Zoom, and some of them are my students in environmental psychology at De La Salle University. Before I start, I'd like to thank National Scientist Lourdes Cruz and my favorite professor, Dr. Gregorio del Pilar, for inviting me to speak here. So let me just share my screen.
Sige po.
Okay, so let me just go ahead and start. In this presentation, I'll talk about environmental psychology. What is environmental psychology? What do we do as environmental psychologists? I'll touch a little bit also on environmental psychology in the Philippines. What are the efforts we did to start and improve environmental psychology work in the country? And the second part of my presentation will talk about the rapidly emerging intersection between climate change and mental health. And let me just explain very briefly how my research program is related to the SDGs. Of course, in many ways, related ito sa maraming SDGs, pero the most directly relevant SDGs would be SDG 12. For example, my first research strand on the application of psychology principles in promoting environmental sustainability is relevant to SDG 12, responsible consumption and production. We try to improve people's behavior and their consumption habits. I also have a research strand on translating climate emotions into climate action, which is directly relevant to SDG 13. My other research strand on protecting communities and the youth from mental health impacts of climate change is directly related to SDG 3, good health and well-being. And lastly, my research program on social inequalities caused and perpetuated by climate injustice, I'll touch a little bit on this in my presentation, is directly relevant to SDG 10, reduce inequalities. And you'll see in my presentation bits and pieces of these research programs and how our work is in our own little ways contributing to SDGs. Okay, let me start with explaining environmental psychology. I am trained as a counseling psychologist, and during the middle part of my PhD, uh, I decided to like work on environmental psychology research because I find it very interesting, but at the same time important and urgent. But if we are to define environmental psychology, it is basically the interplay between humans and their environment. And it may be how the environment influence human thinking, human emotions, and human behaviors, but also how humans shape their physical and natural environment. It is interdisciplinary field, so hindi kailangang maging psychologist para um, mag-work sa environmental psychology research. I would describe myself as an interdisciplinary scholar because I work more with people from other disciplines than psychologists, and I really enjoy it a lot because it's the kind of environment where I learn different perspectives, different methods and approaches. But when we talk about environment, it is not only the natural environment. Environment in environmental psychology may also mean social environment, built environments like buildings, learning environments, etc. You can see on your screen on the left side, this is a deforested area, uh, showing that humans can shape their environment. But also on the right side of your screen, you'll see that this is an elevated house, which is a human response to environmental hazards. Humans decide to elevate their houses to adapt from flooding. So this is an example where human behavior is also impacted, shaped, and affected by natural hazards and threats. And just very quickly, you'll see some of the topics that we are covering in environmental psychology. I designed and teach environmental psychology at De La Salle University at the undergraduate and graduate level. So these are some of the topics. We talk about environmental risk perception. So this is how we perceive risk from and of the environment. Environmental stress. We also talk about health benefits of nature. We talk about psychological constructs like values, and then pro-environmental behavior, and then hanggang sa climate change and mental health. In the next slide, I'll just give you some examples of like studies that are conducted in environmental psychology, just so you can see examples. But one point I want to make sure I convey is that environmental psychology, or psychology in particular, has a very special place in helping address grand challenges, including environmental problems. Because we know that environmental problems, including climate change, especially climate change, are anthropogenic, meaning these are human caused. And we know by the data that climate change and this temperature anomalies increase since we have burned fossil fuel at a large scale. So that's in the late 1800s. And today, we are increasingly feel the impacts of climate change. And this is primarily because of human action. So psychology as a field that's mainly responsible or has the theoretical and methodological toolbox to understand, predict, and perhaps control behavior, it has a very special place in helping address environmental problems. For example, sa psychology, pinag-aaralan namin yung mga cognitive biases. And some of my students in environmental psychology have heard of this. For example, the one cognitive bias we call psychological distance. This is our brain's tendency to think that the threat or the risk is far from us. Akala natin walang risk or hindi naman tayong maapektuhan. But in reality, we are probably equally at risk, than other people. But there are different types of psychological distance. For example, temporal distance. This is our tendency to think that the threat is more likely to happen in the future rather than today. When in reality, climate change is already happening. It's been impacting people's lives and our own lives. It's already there. But our brain is just, have that bias for temporal distance. Another one is social distance. Even though we may be at risk to face environmental threats, we think that these threats are more likely to happen to other people than to you or people like you. That's another type of cognitive bias. Next is geographical distance. This is our tendency to think that the threat is more likely to happen elsewhere, somewhere far, rather than your own community or your own country. So, as a psychologist, our goal is to narrow that psychological distance to make people feel objectively that the threats are already there, so you need to act. Dangerous ang psychological distance because if the wider the distance, the less we perceive the threat, even if the threat's already there. Therefore, we're less likely to act. And we know when we don't act, disasters, we are more likely to be impacted by disasters. Another example related to this, halimbawa, this is a very cool study conducted in New Zealand, proximity to coast, and its relationship with climate change belief. So, climate change belief, I mean, it's defined as whether you believe or not that climate change is happening right now. And then second, whether climate change is anthropogenic or human caused. And then ang ginawa ng mga scholars na ito, for example, si Tassiano Mifont, a very good environmental psychologist, they measured whether your proximity to the coast, how far or how near you reside from the coast, is associated with your climate change belief. So ang ginawa nila, using some high-tech method, they measure people's distance from the coast. And then what they found is that people who reside closer to the coast have greater climate change beliefs. Basta naniniwala sila that climate change is happening, and that it can threaten their lives. Pero baka naman isipin natin, paano naman yung mga bahay na malapit nga sa coast pero elevated? Diba? So ang ginawa nila ay they also controlled for elevation of houses, and what they found is that even after controlling for the elevation of houses, they saw the same pattern that people who reside closer to the coast are more likely to believe that climate change is a threat. Climate change is happening. So that's an example of what we do as environmental psychologists. But I will not over elaborate on that. But I want to give another example. For example, meron ding mga research sa environmental psychology on nature exposure and how it impacts our mental health and our cognitive processes. For example, you may be asking, maganda ba sa mga bata yung ma-expose sila sa nature? In this experiment, what they did is they expose one group of children to natural spaces for at least 1 hour, and then another group of students to built environments, meaning buildings, cities. And then after that, they gave them cognitive tasks. Binigyan po na sila ng mga cognitive tasks. And then mineasure kung gaano sila kabilis makasagot ng tama. And what you find here, mineasure nila yung milliseconds. What you see here is that children who were exposed to the natural environment, when they answer the cognitive task and they answer correctly, it only took them X number of milliseconds, shorter time. So meaning they when they answer correctly, they process quickly. Among those who were exposed to the built environment, when they answer correctly, it took them longer time, mas maraming milliseconds, indicating that there are some positive cognitive effects of exposure to nature to kids' cognitive processes. At marami po pong evidence that I can talk about later when it comes to cognitive processes and mental health. Magugustuhan ito ni Doc Greg dahil meron ding evidence on personality and environmental concern, environmental behavior. This study that I published a few years back in Journal of Individual Differences, I found that light triad traits um, influence Filipinos' environmental concern and their green purchase intentions, specifically humanism and Kantianism. I can talk a little bit on that later, but I need to go to the next slide in the interest of time. And so, before 2020, if you ask the question, where is the Philippines in the environmental psychology discourse? The answer is we are not really on the map. For example, in this review article where they looked at articles published in the flagship journal of environmental psychology, published between 1981 to 2019. These are the countries that really published environmental psychology work. So US, UK, Netherlands, mostly rich countries. The Philippines not on the map. If you look at cross-cultural studies on environmental psychology published in the same period between 1981 to 2019, ito yung mga nagko-collaborate na mga countries, and the thicker the red line, the more collaborations happening in environmental psychology. Again, the Philippines was not in the map. And after 2020, fortunately, there are scholars, Filipino scholars based in the Philippines who began to study environmental psychology, and there have been a rapid increase of environmental psychology work coming from the Philippines written by Filipino scholars. And one of the key work in environmental psychology in the Philippines is this article where I had the privilege to talk about the challenges and how environmental psychology started and the future prospects for environmental psychology in the Philippines. If you want to read this article, feel free to send me an email. Happy to send you a copy. And it's not only in terms of scientific work that we are growing as a community. The Psychological Association of the Philippines in 2020 established the Environmental Psychology Special Interest Group. And currently, I am chairing this special interest group where we're very active in terms of research, advocacy, community work, and hopefully policy in the future. At De La Salle University, I also founded and currently directing the Sphere Lab, or what we call Sustainability, Psychology, and Planetary Health Research Lab. This is a group of students and faculty members at De La Salle where we work on research, advocacy, community work that focus on sustainability, psychology, and planetary health. And we are celebrating our first year in the next 2 weeks, and we're just very proud to say that in our first year, Sphere Lab was able to publish at least 20 articles in high impact journals in the field, and written 4 book chapters, 2 grants awarded, external grants. We organized 10 public webinars, 2 paper presentations, several rejections. And we're very proud that from these rejections, we are inspired to improve our own skills and as a way to improve community well-being and our contribution to healing the planet. I'm done talking about environmental psychology. Let me just very quickly check the time. I will now talk about how climate change is related to mental health. At first blush, it might be very difficult to think that they are actually connected, right? Parang ang hirap isipin, paano nga ba connected ang climate change and mental health? So I'll talk about how they are connected and show you some evidence. And in the next slides, I'll also talk a little bit about climate justice and how it relates to my work and the actual community work that we are doing at the grassroots level as well as international level. I like to point out that we know that the climate crisis affects everyone in the world. In the Philippines, we know that we experience flooding, we experience typhoons, heat waves. We're familiar with what happened even in rich countries like in the U.S., in in California. We heard about the massive fire in California, and scientists are convinced that it is at least in part climate induced. Hold on, my computer is hanging. Okay, and Mother Earth already gave us a deadline that if we don't reduce global mean temperature, or if we don't limit global mean temperature by 1.5 degrees by year 2030, climate change might be irreversible. And ano nga bang ibig sabihin ng 1.5 degrees? That means at least 50% of economic activities globally has to stop. And at the current rate, we are not on track. Uh, if you are to guess, where are we right now in terms of global mean average post-industrial levels, industrial period, we are actually right now at 1.2 degrees. And we are on track based on scientific work to reach 1.5 degrees as early as 2027. We won't even be able to limit it by 1.5 by 2030. The current or recent developments globally are not really in favor of climate mitigation. For example, Trump's withdrawal from Paris Agreement is really not helping because that means the U.S., the main contributor to climate change, will more aggressively burn fossil fuel. And in the discourse of climate change and human health, there's already rich evidence that climate change impacts human health, specifically physical health. We know that climate change events are associated with injuries and different sickness. For example, dengue, very popular in the Philippines. Public health experts, my friends who are in the public health field, would tell me that, for example, in Japan, wala naman daw dengue sa Japan noon, pero because of increased heat, global mean temperature, may dengue na ngayon sa Japan. Gusto daw kasi ng mga lamok na yung mainit na temperature at saka yung mga buildings. And while the impact of climate change on human health is rich, there's one aspect of human health that's neglected, and that is the impact on mental health. This is often neglected because mental health is often invisible. It cannot be seen right away. But fortunately, since 2020, there's a rapid increase of mental health and climate change work. For example, when we did the review, yung noong 2020, around 100 plus pa lang ang climate change and mental health publications. And by 2024, there are around 500, an increase of at least 300% of scientific work related to climate change and mental health. And you may be thinking, how are they connected? So it's very complex, but what I'm going to say is an oversimplification of how they are connected. Climate change hazards can directly impact our mental health. For example, in the Philippines, we know when typhoons happen, um, people can lose their lives, and family members who are left can have mental health problems. We know based on evidence that these typhoons and hazards are correlated with depression, trauma, etc. But sometimes And oftentimes, the connection between climate change hazards and mental health are very indirect and very insidious. For example, climate change hazards are causing losses in terms of harvest, crops and livestock, forced migration, loss of habitats. People need to migrate and to, sometimes displaced. And these, in many ways, are interconnected to people's mental health. So you imagine a farmer who lost their livelihood. That also means no money, no food on the table for their kids, and cannot send their kids to school. The emotional reaction and mental health toll to a farmer and their family is, something we cannot neglect. So it just to make a point that it is connected in a very complex way, and my explanation is an oversimplification. We know based on evidence that this massive mental health impacts of climate change are documented scientifically. For example, if we go to the Philippines, Typhoon Yolanda, internationally known Haiyan, um, are, have caused mental health problems to many Filipinos, and one of those mental health problems is post-traumatic stress disorder. The prevalence is quite high, and this is an underestimation because not everyone affected were surveyed or assessed. We also know that hindi lang naman typhoons ang climate change hazards na naranasan natin, including in the Philippines. If you remember last summer, 'di ba? That's a record-breaking heat and heat wave. For the very first time in Philippine history, there are closures of schools because of heat. And we know that heat is correlated with many different outcomes, including psychological outcomes. Based on this study, for example, um, temperature increase over time is correlated with self-reported mental health distress. We also know that drought caused by extreme heat is driving suicide among farmers, and this is evidence among farmers in India. Now, I'm very curious in what ways farmers in the Philippines are affected by climate change related events. I don't have the data on my hand, but I'm very curious about that. We also know that childhood exposure to air pollution increase risk of schizophrenia. And this is evidence among people born in Denmark, for example, between 1980 to 1984. And the explanation is that exposure to NO2 and NOx during childhood subsequently influence their brain, increasing their risk of schizophrenia. And one thing I want to highlight is the buzz term in the climate change and mental health work, which is climate anxiety. I will define climate anxiety for you. Climate anxiety is your worries about the current and future threats of climate change. So focus on the term worries. That's a particular emotion. But also, the definition at the moment in the literature is not uh, it's not very clear because some scientists would define climate anxiety more like an umbrella term of many other different emotions. For example, some would say that climate anxiety could mean feeling powerless, feeling frustrated, that climate change cannot be addressed, feeling helpless, afraid, grieving, sad, etc. So it can be an umbrella term based on the literature, but admittedly, we need to do more work to clarify its definition. And at this point, before I give you evidence on climate anxiety, let me bring you to our beloved country, the Philippines. Globally, the Philippines is always ranked as the one of the most climate vulnerable countries in the world. The most recent ranking indicates that we are top one in terms of climate change risk and vulnerability. If you zoom in to Southeast Asia, you'll see here that the redder the country, the more vulnerable it is to climate change. Unfortunately, our country is the reddest. Now, we have now 7,600 plus islands. When sea level rise happens in an island country like the Philippines, we will be the first ones to be affected. Um, we are, because of our geographical location, we are prone to typhoons. We know that at least or around 20 typhoons per year is faced by Filipinos. So if I am to ask you, can you guess on average how many typhoons does a Filipino experience or face in their lifetime? You can type in the chat or you can just guess in your head. So if a Filipino would live an average of 70 plus years, therefore, as an ordinary Filipino would face at least 1,200 to 1,400 typhoons in our lifetime. Yet, in high level climate change decision making, our perspectives are not really centered and elevated. So that's really one concern. And in terms of evidence on climate anxiety, this first global evidence involving 10 countries showing severity of climate anxiety among children and young people showed that in these 10 countries involved, the Philippines has the most number of children and young people with moderately to severe and extremely severe levels of climate anxiety. Our young people are very worried about their future in the era of climate change. And in this paper published in the Lancet Planetary Health, we tried to provide an explanation on how climate change impact in the Philippines' vulnerability, maybe how our young people is educated in terms of climate change may play a role. I will not labor you on the content of this article, but it's open access and it's a short read. We also published climate anxiety in the Philippines in the journal Climate Change and Health. We provided explanations on why climate anxiety is experienced by many Filipinos, what are the potential pathways, and how can we move forward. And this is published with a very good friend, Dr. Renzo Ginto. So while I'm talking about climate anxiety, I acknowledge that climate change can cause mental health problems and disorders, number one. Climate change can also exacerbate the mental health problems of those who already have pre-existing mental health concerns. But in terms of climate anxiety, one thing I want to emphasize is that climate anxiety in particular is not a mental health disorder. Technically, it is not listed in the DSM-5, or it's like the Bible of psychologists and psychiatrists, where all the mental disorders are listed. We use that for diagnosis. Climate anxiety is not there yet. But climate anxiety, I would argue, is a normal response because, number one, climate change is real. It's already happening and threatening the lives of people all over the world, more particularly Filipinos and our young people. It is only normal to feel anxious. As a psychologist, what worries me more is when we don't have any emotional reaction despite the enormous threat of climate change. So my work as a psychologist is to figure out how I can translate all these climate emotions, particularly climate anxiety, into action. How can we make sure that these emotions become a motivation for us to act and help address climate change? And that has been the focus also of the work of many environmental psychologists. However, while we see in many places in the world that young people take to the streets to protest against climate change, protest governments and corporate against corporates who really cause or drive the climate crisis. Climate activism is not always possible in all contexts. Some places are very dangerous for climate activism. The Philippines, for example, is one of the countries that is most dangerous, technically one of the deadliest countries for environmental and climate activists. We have the most number of murders of environmental and climate activists driven by, say, political and commercial drivers. We are definitely number one in Asia. In globally, we kapantay na kasama natin sa mataas na rate ng murders ng environmental defenders ang Colombia, Brazil, etc. For example, in September 2023, two young women environmental defenders, nagpo-protest sila doon sa reclamation sa Manila Bay, suddenly went missing, abducted. And after 2 weeks, lumabas sila sa isang press conference. And allegedly, at base sa statement ng dalawang young people na ito, it was the military who abducted them. That's according to their statement. And then the National Security Council later on said that these two young people are not really environmental activists, but leftist group. So, and many people and even international organizations would call for them to stop red tagging, for example. But this is just an example of how dangerous it is to be an environmental and climate defender in the Philippines. And so part of my work is to talk about or promote climate justice. But climate justice is a very complex concept, a very complex issue. The way people define climate justice depends on who you ask, depende where they are in the climate justice issue. But one very rough definition of climate justice is who or which country mainly causes climate change and who are the most hurt because of climate change. In my work, I try to represent the global south. You see here countries colored with red are global south countries. To define them, these are countries often are developing countries. Often global south countries are countries with very minimal contribution to climate change. They're not major, historically major extractor of fossil fuel. And global north countries, on the other hand, often are rich countries. Often they are historically major drivers of fossil fuel emission, greenhouse gas emission, extractors of fossil fuel, and often they are colonizers. Global south countries, on the other hand, often are colonized countries. So if you see here, the data on top CO2 emitting countries between 1750 and 2020, you'll see that most countries that are historically top emitters would be US and many Western countries. Of course, with the exemption of China and India that are modern emerging economies. Of course, China and India can say, well, currently we are major fossil fuel or greenhouse gas emitter, but we are only using our carbon footprint, our carbon budget. We're still within our carbon budget. But historically, it's the US and European countries that are major contributors to greenhouse gases. And in terms of mental health impacts, a global evidence suggests that people in the global south, for example, India, Nigeria, Philippines, even Brazil, have the highest reports of mental health toll because of climate change. I already mentioned Yolanda in 2013, but this is just an example of countries like the Philippines in the global south who are not major drivers of climate change but suffer the most severe consequences. Typhoon Haiyan or Yolanda, the strongest typhoon ever recorded, killed at least 6,000 people in our country. Many families are displaced. Many people were missing. Billions of dollars for economic losses. And more than a decade after Yolanda, many Filipinos still do not have proper houses. And the climate change and inequality are always intertwined because families in poverty often would face the severe consequences of climate change. Kahit hindi sila naman major users of energy. And people in poverty often would be forced to reside in areas where they are exposed to elements. and then therefore they're more exposed to the health risk. But they are also the same people who did not cause the climate crisis, but they are also the same people who have no access to the health services, quality health services that they deserve. That's a big problem, especially in the Philippines, where the gap between the rich and the poor is just very wide. Climate justice is also gender justice because when disasters and bad things happen, it's most often females who are um, facing the more severe consequences. A familiar instance of a big disaster or crisis that we experience is COVID-19. We know that when COVID-19 happens, it's um, females have multiple layers of responsibilities, compared to males. And in the context of climate change, um, females often, when crisis happens, would be exposed to sexual and gender violence. Imagine a Filipino female would, in times of drought, would walk 1 kilometer or more to get a pail of water and would be exposed to gender and sexual violence, something that would rarely be experienced by a male. Um, and we know that based on evidence that the extreme events is associated with gender-based violence, and this is based on systematic review already. And in many places, for example, in South Africa, um, when climate change, war, conflict, and disasters happen, families are forced to sold their daughters in exchange of cows, for example. Uh, Childhood marriages increase, when disasters or when crisis happens. We also know, based on this evidence, that violent crime increase, as temperature increase. And uh, in many analysis, they would even analyze temperature increase over time and police uh, documents from police of interpersonal conflict and violence. And it's not only gender violence or gender justice, but climate justice is also intergenerational justice. Because young people and the next generations who did not cause climate change will be the generations who will face the more severe and increasingly frightening consequences of the climate crisis. So it's just basically unfair. The Philippines has a very interesting history in terms of intergenerational justice. For example, the case of Attorney Oposa and Secretary Facturan in 1993. Attorney Oposa, fresh from law school, sued the Secretary of the ENR, Secretary Facturan, to stop the timber licenses of timber companies extracting Philippine forest. And Attorney Facturan said that he is representing his children, the children of his friends, and the next generations of Filipinos. And the first question of the in the RTC, the judge was Judge Hilario Davide. The first question was, can the next generations be represented in court? Heavy debate. And then eventually, they decided, yes, the next generations can be represented in court. And eventually, the Supreme Court upheld this decision, and the licenses of timber companies were canceled. But I want to make a point that that is 31 years ago, And while more developed countries were talking about environmental studies, in the Philippines, we're already talking about intergenerational justice. And soon after, this case is cited in many courts in different parts of the world to invoke intergenerational justice. At this point, I'm in the last few slides of my presentation. I just want to share uh, less on research, but more on the action and community building that I've been involved in the past few years. I already mentioned that I established and currently directing Sphere Lab. But also, aside from research, we're also engaged in working with families in local communities. For example, we have been providing climate literacy and mental health interventions and programs among farmers in the Philippines, families in low-lying islands in the Philippines, etc. We also, in collaboration with different experts and friends in the field, we have established a climate change and mental health community, a community of Filipinos from different disciplines and sectors to talk about what we can do to address climate change and mental health in the Philippines. And we are also part of a global community where we have this project we finished last year. We call it Connecting Climate Minds. It's a climate change and mental health project where we connected communities, created and connected communities of practice. We basically created research and action agenda on climate and change and mental health. And we did this in 7 SDG regions in the world. And in Eastern and Southeast Asia, together with a good friend, Dr. Renzo Ginto, we co-led the Eastern and Southeastern Asia. We convened different experts and people from different sectors in the region to talk about climate change and mental health. What do we know so far? What do we not know in terms of research, policies, education, etc.? And we have created a research and action agenda on climate change and mental health. We basically have a document of research questions that we should be answering in the next coming years on climate change and mental health. The outputs that we had, we involving 870 experts globally in 80 countries. We conducted 10 regional and thematic agendas, 25 case studies. We have 35 lived experience stories, and we did this in these 7 SDG regions. We published a document in our website, and this paper published in Nature Mental Health is like a summary of our project. If you want to access, you can simply type the title, and you should be able to access the article. In summary, I want to highlight that each field and specialization is an important piece for addressing grand challenges like environmental crisis and climate change. Psychology has the theoretical and methodological toolbox to spark climate action and address the mental health impacts of the climate crisis. It is time to give more attention to the of mental health aspects of climate, planetary, and health discourse. That when we talk about climate change and mental health nexus, let us not forget the historical and structural injustices associated with the issue. We can gain more meaningful insights from the rich experiences of people in the global south, particularly in the Philippines, in relation to climate change. That taking climate action is an expression of our commitment to climate, social, gender, intergenerational justice, and healthy and resilient Philippines. Thank you so much.
Nako Doc, maraming salamat po sa inyong napaka-enlightening at napaka-eye-opener na topic. Sabi nyo kanina, mahaba-haba yung 40 minutes pero parang feeling ko kulang ata ang isang oras. So as of now, we're going to open this afternoon. Doc Jan, maraming salamat po uli sa inyong napaka-insightful na topic. At lagi po natin tandaan, ang isang magandang environment can lead into a healthy mental health. So magandang hapon sa lahat and see you again next week.
You.